The sun was just beginning to dip behind the wide stretch of prairie when she appeared at the edge of the ranch yard. Dust clung to her boots, her dress was faded, and her face carried the look of someone who had walked a long way without stopping. She didn't rush, she didn't call out. She simply stood there, hands folded in front of her, waiting to be noticed. The rancher saw her from the porch. He was a man who didn't take kindly to strangers, especially ones who showed up unannounced. His place was no grand estate, just a working ranch with more chores than he could manage and more silence than he cared to admit. The hands he hired never stayed long. Most gave up after a season, saying the work was too hard and the land too lonely. He didn't expect anyone to come looking for it. When he stepped down to face her, he noticed the way she lowered her eyes, not in fear but in quiet respect. She didn't look weak. She didn't look proud either. Just steady, like she had already seen too much of life to be shaken by his presence. For a long moment the two stood facing each other, the only sound the soft shuffle of the horses in the corral. Finally she spoke. Her voice was low, almost careful, as if she used words the way a miser used coins, spending only what was needed. "I don't talk much, mister," she said, "but I can cook." The rancher wasn't a man easily surprised, but those words gave him pause. He had expected a plea for shelter, maybe a request for water, perhaps even someone asking for a day's pay in exchange for hard labor. But this was different. Cooking wasn't just a chore out here. It was the heart of a home, the thing that kept men going after endless hours of work in the sun. A good cook could change the feel of a place. A bad one could drive men away faster than winter wind. He studied her again, this stranger who had offered no story, no explanation, only her skill and her silence. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the stir of something unexpected. Not trust, not yet, but curiosity. Enough to make him lean forward just a little, enough to make him answer her with words he hadn't planned to say. He didn't answer her right away. The rancher was not a man to make quick judgments, and he had learned the hard way that most strangers brought more trouble than good. Still, something in the way she stood there, quiet, steady, without begging or explaining, made him pause. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't shifting her weight like someone desperate or nervous. She waited, as if the decision was his alone and she had already made her peace with whatever came of it. Finally he nodded once, a slow tilt of his head toward the cabin. "We'll see," he said. No promises, no warm welcome, just those two words, but for her they were enough. She followed him across the yard, her steps measured, her eyes taking in the corral, the weathered barn, the stacks of split wood. Everything about the place spoke of work, hard, endless work. It wasn't the kind of ranch that gave much, but it held together because the man who ran it refused to quit. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, leather, and dust. A kettle sat cold on the stove, and a pile of dishes was left to one side. The rancher motioned with his hand toward the kitchen, then leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. He wanted to see what she would do, how she would carry herself in a place not yet hers. She removed her shawl, folded it carefully over a chair, and rolled up her sleeves. Without a word she went to the stove, opened the firebox, and studied the wood stacked inside. She didn't ask where the kindling was. She simply found it, broke it down, and lit the fire with the calm precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. The rancher watched, his face unreadable, but inside he felt a shift. Most who came to work for him, men or women, hesitated first. They asked too many questions. She didn't. She worked. Within minutes, the room began to change. The sharp smell of smoke was replaced by the warm crackle of burning wood. She set a pot of water to boil, checked the flour barrel, and looked over the shelves as if she had lived there long enough to know them already. The rancher caught himself straightening slightly, noticing the way her movements filled the cabin with something he hadn't felt in years. Order. It was not long before the ranch hands returned from the fields. Dusty, tired, hungry men, their boots dragging across the yard. They were used to biscuits that crumbled like dust and beans left too long on the fire. Most had stopped expecting anything better. But that evening when they walked into the cabin, they stopped short. The air carried the smell of cornbread, fresh and golden, and a stew thick with meat and potatoes simmering low on the stove. The men glanced at each other, then at the stranger by the hearth. She did not look up at them, did not offer a greeting, only stirred the pot and set the bread on the table as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Their eyes went to the rancher, who gave no explanation, only a grunt that told them to sit down. They ate in silence at first. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the soft clink of tin cups. Then, slowly, the silence gave way to mutters of surprise. One man chuckled under his breath, another asked for a second helping. Before long, the table that had so often been a place of weariness was filled with something else. Life. The stranger said nothing, only moved between stove and table with quiet grace, refilling plates, placing more bread down, and clearing what was empty. The rancher kept his eyes on her, measuring. She hadn't tried to please them with talk, hadn't offered smiles or chatter. She had let the food speak, and it spoke well. The men respected that in a way they didn't even recognize at first. Out here, words were cheap, but work was everything. When the meal was done, she washed the dishes without being told, her hands steady in the warm water. The men left one by one, tipping their hats, murmuring thanks in their rough voices. She acknowledged none of it, her focus fixed on finishing what she had started. By the time the last plate was dried and stacked, the cabin felt different. The rancher couldn't quite name it, but he knew it was true. Later that night, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the lamps were turned down low, the rancher sat by the door, smoking his pipe in silence. She sat across from him, sewing a tear in her dress with thread she carried in her small bag. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The fire popped in the stove, the crickets sang outside, and the night settled around them. For the first time in a long while, the rancher felt the weight of loneliness lift, just slightly. Not gone, not forgotten, but lighter. And it had nothing to do with words, only with the quiet presence of someone who knew how to make a place feel alive again. As the last ember in the stove dimmed, he glanced at her one more time. She had finished her sewing, folded the dress neatly across her lap, and sat still, her eyes lowered, calm as ever. He realized then that hiring her had not been about her words at all. It had been about the silence she carried, a silence that spoke louder than any promise could. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm that felt different from the life the rancher had known for so long. Work on the land was always hard, sunup to sundown, with endless tasks that never seemed to finish. But now, when the men came back from the fields, they were met not with the tired scrape of burnt beans or stale bread, but with the warm smell of food that reminded them of homes they hadn't seen in years. The stranger, the quiet woman who had walked onto the ranch with dust on her boots and little more than determination in her eyes, had filled the cabin with something unexpected, comfort. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then her words were short and careful. Yet her silence didn't feel like distance. It carried weight, as if every glance, every small gesture she made, told more of her story than any long explanation could. When she kneaded dough in the morning, the strength in her hands spoke of years spent doing the same. When she stirred a pot or set plates in front of the men, her quiet precision spoke of pride in work done right. The ranch hands, men roughened by wind and labor, began to notice the change in themselves. They rose earlier, returned sharper, as if the promise of a good meal waiting for them gave their efforts new purpose. They joked more at the table, laughter echoing against the log walls, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. And though she never joined in their banter, they found themselves lowering their voices when she moved close, showing her a respect they did not give easily. The rancher, too, felt the shift. He had lived with silence before, but it had been a hollow silence, empty and sharp. The silence she brought was different, solid, steady, the kind that filled the air without suffocating it. He found himself watching her more than he admitted, studying the way she carried herself. She never wasted a movement. She never left a task unfinished. There was a patience in her, the kind only learned through hardship. One evening, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done, The rancher stepped outside. The sky stretched wide and endless, stars scattered like dust across black velvet. He leaned against the rail, pipe in hand, staring at the horizon as if searching for something he couldn't name. He heard the door creak softly behind him, and when he turned, she was there, setting a small plate down on the rail. A slice of pie, simple and plain. She didn't say a word, only gave a slight nod before turning back inside. He stood there a long time, the taste of the pie mixing with the night air, and for the first time in years, he felt the strange ache of gratitude he couldn't put into words. But not everyone beyond the ranch fence looked kindly on her presence. Word traveled quickly in small towns, carried by whispers that grew sharper with every retelling. Some said she was hiding something. Others claimed no good woman wandered alone across the plains unless she had been driven out. There were those who muttered that the rancher had lost his judgment, taking in a stranger who spoke little of her past. The rancher ignored it at first, but even he could not keep the weight of gossip from pressing at the back of his mind. One afternoon, he rode into town for supplies. As he tied his horse by the general store, two men on the porch gave him a look that lingered too long. One spat into the dirt and muttered, "Funny thing, her just showing up like that. Folks around here deserve to know who they're living beside." The rancher said nothing. He had no use for idle talk, but when he rode back to the ranch, the words echoed louder than he expected. That evening, as he sat at the table, he found himself studying her face in the lamplight. She never flinched beneath his gaze, never offered more than her quiet presence. For a moment he wondered what she was hiding, what truths lay buried beneath her silence. The next morning, a storm rolled over the plains. The sky turned black with heavy clouds, and the wind howled like a living thing. The men worked against the rain to keep the fences from giving way, while the rancher rode hard to bring in strays before the floodwaters rose. When he returned, soaked and weary, the cabin glowed with firelight. Inside, she had already prepared dry clothes, a meal steaming on the table, and bandages ready for his bleeding hand. She said nothing as she wrapped the cloth tight, her fingers gentle but sure. He watched her, the storm raging outside, and realized that whatever secrets she carried, she belonged here now. Not because she spoke it, but because she proved it in every action, every quiet moment of care. That night, as the rain battered the windows and the thunder shook the earth, the rancher sat awake by the fire. She slept in the chair opposite, her head tilted against her shoulder, hands folded in her lap. The flames cast a golden glow across her face, softening the lines of weariness. He studied her as if trying to read a book without words, piecing together the story she never told. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin there was calm. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was close enough for a man who had forgotten what peace felt like. The rancher leaned back, his eyes heavy, the sound of the storm blending with the steady rhythm of her breathing. And for the first time in years, he let himself rest. Morning broke clear after the storm, the land washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and grass. The ranch yard was a mess, branches scattered, a section of the fence down, and the barn door hanging loose on one hinge. The men moved quickly to set things right, their boots sinking into the mud, their voices cutting through the fresh air. She was already up before the sun, her hair tied back, the stove hot with coffee and bread, bowls of oats waiting on the table. The rancher stepped in, weary from hours of checking the cattle, and found her setting down a plate of eggs and bacon. She did not ask if he was hungry. She didn't need to. He ate in silence, each bite steadying him after the long night. She sat across from him, mending a shirt torn at the seam, her hands moving with the same calm rhythm she carried into everything she touched. There was no chatter, no wasted words. The only sound was the clink of his fork and the hiss of the fire. Somehow, that silence felt fuller than any conversation. As the day wore on, the ranch settled back into its rhythm. But the storm had stirred more than broken fences. The whispers in town grew sharper, carried by men who found too much comfort in suspicion. Some claimed the rancher was blind, letting a stranger into his home. Others said she must be running from something. Why else would she keep her story locked behind silence? By late afternoon, a pair of riders showed up at the ranch gate. The rancher saw them first. He walked out, his jaw set, his shadow long against the sun. They asked questions, their voices carrying the easy arrogance of men who believed gossip was truth. Where had she come from? Why did she hide behind silence? Was she the kind of woman fit to be on a ranch at all? She stood in the doorway, her face calm but her hands folded tight in her apron. She did not answer. She let the rancher do it for her. His words were few, but they cut sharper than any knife. She's here, she works hard, that's all you need to know. The riders sneered, but they left. Still, the weight of their suspicion lingered in the dust they kicked up on the trail. That evening, the cabin felt heavier. The men at the table ate in quieter tones, the laughter from nights before dimmed by the tension of outside eyes. She did not let it show, but the rancher saw the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her hands moved more carefully, as if she carried the burden of judgment that wasn't hers to carry. Later, when the men had gone, the rancher found her outside near the well, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The moon was high, casting silver light across the plains. He stood beside her for a while, saying nothing. At last she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I told you I don't talk much, mister, but I work, that's who I am." He studied her, the quiet strength in her posture, the honesty in her words. He had seen many people come and go, some full of promises, some quick with excuses. She gave neither. She gave only her labor, her silence, and her steady presence. And in that, there was more truth than any story could hold. The next days tested that truth. A calf went missing in the hills, forcing the men into long rides across rough country. Supplies ran low, and she managed the kitchen with scraps, turning little into enough. When one of the hands cut his leg on barbed wire, she tended him with the same care she had given the rancher after the storm. She never asked for thanks. She never reminded them of her worth. She simply kept working, her silence carrying a strength that grew harder to ignore. One night, as the fire burned low, the rancher watched her place a fresh loaf of bread on the table, her movements slow with exhaustion. He realized then how much had changed. His ranch had always been a place of toil and grit, but never of warmth. Now, even with suspicion hanging in the air, even with gossip waiting down the road, the cabin had become something more than shelter. It had become a home again. Yet the past has a way of chasing those who think they've outrun it. A week later, as the sun dipped low, a wagon rattled into the yard. A man climbed down, his eyes hard, his voice carrying the weight of unfinished business. He asked for her by name, the name she had not spoken since the day she arrived. The rancher felt the air tighten, the men gathering near, their faces set. She stood still, her hands at her sides, her eyes meeting the stranger's without flinching. She did not deny it, she did not explain. She only said in her quiet way, "That life is behind me." The man scoffed, muttered words meant to sting, then left, his wagon disappearing into the dust. But his presence left a mark. The men whispered that night, wondering what truth lay behind her silence. The rancher heard them, but he said nothing. He only watched her move about the cabin, calm as ever, carrying herself with the same steady dignity she always had. That night when the others had gone, he found himself speaking words he had not planned. "I don't care where you came from. You're here now, that's what matters." She did not answer, not with words. She simply met his eyes for the first time, held them steady, and in that quiet moment he felt the truth settle between them like stone. Whatever her past was, it no longer belonged to anyone but her. And whatever future waited, it had already begun here, in the silence they shared. The days after the wagon left were uneasy. The men spoke less at supper, their voices low, their glances often slipping toward her when they thought she wasn't looking. The gossip from town had crossed the fence line and seeped into the bunkhouse. Some wondered aloud if she was trouble. Others said it didn't matter so long as the food kept coming. But unease, once planted, grows fast in hard soil. She felt it, though she never said a word. Her hands moved the same across the bread dough. Her steps were just as measured when she walked between stove and table, but there was a heaviness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She knew what it meant to be doubted, to be watched like someone who didn't belong. The rancher saw it too, though he tried not to let it show. One evening, the tension broke. A young hand, too new to know the weight of his words, muttered under his breath that maybe she was only hiding out until someone came to drag her back. The rancher slammed his cup down hard enough to make the table rattle. The room went silent, all eyes turning to him. His voice was low but sharp, a tone that cut deeper than a shout. "She's earned her place here. That's the end of it." The boy looked down, cheeks red, and the others kept their eyes on their plates. She stood at the end of the table, a basket of bread in her hands, her face calm as always. But when her gaze lifted to the rancher, there was something unspoken in it, something steady and strong, like a rope thrown across a storm. The next morning she was outside before dawn, hauling water from the well, feeding the hens, moving through the yard with the same quiet rhythm. The rancher watched her from the porch, his coffee steaming in the cool air. He realized then that her silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. It was the way she had survived in a world quick to judge and slow to forgive. The work on the ranch grew harder as summer deepened. The heat baked the earth until the grass crackled underfoot, and storms rolled in sudden and violent, tearing down what little peace the land offered. One afternoon, word came that cattle had broken through the fence line and strayed into the hills. The men saddled up fast, the rancher at their head. She stood at the doorway as they rode out, her braid catching in the wind, her eyes following them until the dust swallowed the last horse. For 2 days they searched, riding the ridges, driving the strays back through gullies and canyons. The rancher returned late on the second night, weary and dust-choked, his arm bleeding from a fall. When he stepped into the cabin, she was already waiting with water, cloth, and the same calm presence that had steadied him before. She said nothing, only took his hand and began to clean the wound. He winced as the cloth bit into the scrape, but her touch was sure, her face close in the lamplight, her silence as steady as her hands. As she worked, he found himself speaking without meaning to. "Men can say what they like. I know what I see." She paused, her eyes lifting to his, the cloth still in her hand. For a long moment the only sound was the crackle of the fire. She didn't answer, not with words, but the look she gave him was more than enough. The days passed, and slowly the whispers faded. The men grew used to her presence again, and the town found new stories to gnaw on. She remained as she had been from the start, quiet, steady, carrying her share without complaint. Yet something had shifted between her and the rancher. He found himself listening for the sound of her steps in the kitchen, watching the way she leaned over the garden rows in the morning sun, noticing the small hum she let slip sometimes when she thought no one was near. One evening, after the work was done and the men had drifted off, he sat outside on the porch. The sky was burning with colors, pink and gold spilling across the horizon. She came out with a pot of coffee, poured him a cup, then sat in the chair beside him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence stretched between them, not heavy but easy, like two parts of a song that had finally found each other. The rancher leaned back, his hat low over his brow, and thought about how the land had worn him down over the years. It had taken so much: his strength, his peace, his family. Yet here was this woman, who had come with nothing but a quiet voice and steady hands, and somehow she had given something back. When the stars began to pierce the sky, she stood, folded her shawl around her shoulders, and gave him a nod before stepping inside. He stayed a while longer, staring out across the darkening plains, the weight in his chest different than it had been before. Not lighter, not heavier, just changed. The ranch was still the same, hard, unforgiving, full of work that never ended. But inside its walls, something had shifted. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone felt it. The heat of summer slowly gave way to cooler winds, the kind that carried the smell of dry grass and the promise of autumn. The ranch carried on as it always had, long days, harder nights, work that stretched from dawn until the stars. Yet within the cabin the rhythm had changed. Meals came with warmth, silence came with peace, and the weight of loneliness seemed a little easier to bear. The woman still spoke little, but the men no longer found her silence unsettling. They had grown used to it, even grateful for it. Her quiet ways made the table steadier, the evenings calmer. Some nights, after long hours in the saddle, the rancher found himself stepping inside to the smell of stew or fresh bread, and for the first time in years, the cabin felt like more than shelter. It felt like a place to come home to. The rancher carried himself the same as ever, stern, watchful, a man who gave few words and asked for fewer. But his eyes followed her more often now. He noticed the way she tucked her braid behind her shoulder when the wind caught it, the way she hummed low while she worked the dough, the way her hands, worn from years of labor, moved with a gentleness that spoke of things left unsaid. He didn't speak of it, but he carried it inside him like a secret he wasn't ready to let go. One afternoon, trouble came again. A rider from town brought word that rustlers had been seen near the hills, men looking for easy cattle to steal. The rancher saddled up with his hands, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed with the kind of focus that came only from years of defending what was his. She watched them ride off, standing in the doorway as the dust swallowed them whole. Her hands clutched the apron at her waist, her face calm but her heart pounding. The men returned late, the rancher at their head, weary but unhurt. They had turned the rustlers back, but not without cost. One of the hands carried a cut on his arm, and another limped badly from a fall. She set to work without a word, her hands steady, her eyes sharp with focus. She cleaned wounds, tore bandages, and brewed bitter herbs into medicine. The men, hardened by years on the trail, winced but said nothing. They trusted her hands, even if they did not know the story of where she had learned. The rancher watched her in silence, his respect deepening with each careful motion. She asked for nothing, expected nothing, and gave everything she had in the quiet way she always had. When the men finally settled into their bunks, she sat by the stove, her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap. The rancher lowered himself into the chair opposite her, the firelight flickering across his face. For a long time neither spoke. Then at last he said, "You've done more here than you know." She lifted her eyes to his, and though she gave no reply, the truth passed between them like a current. Words weren't needed. He understood her silence and she understood his. The seasons shifted quickly. Frost came early, biting at the edges of the fields. The cattle grew restless in the chill, and the men worked harder to prepare for winter. Inside the cabin, she kept the fire burning, the shelves stocked, the meals hearty enough to carry them through long nights. The rancher found himself relying on her presence more than he realized. When the wind howled against the shutters and the land seemed to stretch cold and empty, her calm was the thing that held it all together. One evening, when snow had just begun to dust the ground, the rancher returned from checking the herds. He shook the frost from his coat, stomped the snow from his boots, and stepped inside to the warm glow of lamplight. She was there by the hearth, mending a pair of gloves with careful stitches. The firelight played against her face, and for the first time he allowed himself to wonder, not who she had been before, but who she might become here. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the steady sound of her needle pulling thread. He sat across from her, his rough hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed on hers. She looked up once briefly, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but something solid, like a foundation being laid in silence. The days continued, marked by work, by storms, by long nights under the endless prairie sky. But the rancher no longer carried his burdens alone, and though the woman had come with nothing but a few belongings and a quiet voice, she had given something far greater than either of them expected. She had given the ranch its heart back. The men knew it, though they never said it. The rancher knew it, though he carried it in silence. And she showed it in the only way she ever did, through work, through patience, through the steady strength that had carried her this far. And so the ranch stood stronger, not because of walls or fences, but because of the quiet bond that had grown inside its cabin. A bond that needed no words to be understood and no explanation to be true.